Welcome, everyone, to Conversations with Impact,
a podcast for educators focused on making an impact and getting implementation right. Well, welcome, everybody, to Conversations with Impact. We are so glad that you're listening today with us as we talk about a topic that we've been engaged in and super excited about, and we can't wait to continue to unpack and unfold.
Great. Yeah, it's so nice to be back together again and having another conversation with Impact. Stephen, it is great. So what are we going to talk about together today? What's been on your mind?
Well, there's only been, I'm going to be honest, Janice, there's only been one thing that's been on my mind since last week. Shortly after our podcast last week, I got to fall in love with a new girl. I love her to the moon and back. She's beautiful. She's my new grandbaby girl. My son and his wonderful wife just had a baby last week, and that's all I can think about. So yes, I can't wait to talk about implementation, but man, my head has been just all about thinking about that baby girl, baby granddaughter of mine. It's super exciting.
Great. Congratulations. Such big news. Becoming a grandparent is, as everyone always says, it's one of the best things in the world. And I know that you're really fortunate that you were able to be together, that you guys are in the same state, that with given all the COVID restrictions, everyone had all their vaccinations and you could safely gather, because a lot of families weren't able to do that, right? So we're all these families were welcoming new children into their lives and grandchildren, and they weren't able to share that. So I'm so happy for you all that worked out, that you get to actually participate. It's awesome.
Yeah, well, and they're both nurses, and my wife's a nurse, and everybody's been vaccinated. So we actually got to go over there and just be with them. And I think I held my baby granddaughter for hours. I would not let her back to mom or dad. I just could not let her go. And it was funny because I'm staring at her and I can't keep my eyes off of her, and I'm just staring at her, and they're having conversations. And then later on I look up and I ask a question, and they're like, we already just talked about that. Like, I completely missed the conversation because I'm so enthralled by this little human being who's just, I cannot wait to just watch her grow and be a part of her life. So I'm thrilled.
That's great. That's wonderful. We're going to be talking today about some other things that are going on. And mine is that I'm not in my usual place. You may notice I have a different background here today. And I have some big news too, because my mother is fully vaccinated. Mm-hmm. Yay, finally. And we have not seen each other in over a year. So I was able to, again, since we were able to be vaccinated and safe, I am now in the Seattle area in Washington, in the United States, but it's in a little town called Edmonds, right on the Puget Sound, with it's framed by the the Cascade Mountain Range. I had to ask Mom, like, am I saying this right? Mm-hmm. So beautiful. And most importantly, we're just cooking together and hanging out together, and I'm doing some work, but really bonding over a long time. And I'm so proud of her because I said, you did such a good job keeping safe and maintaining. And because she lives alone and she got pretty isolated and lonely. So now we're having some time together.
That is awesome.
Awesome.
And that, I know she's probably just thrilled that you're there and finally being able to see you and having to be apart for so long. This is what an opportunity to kind of rejoice. And I'm sure you guys gave each other just a big, long hug.
Yes, maybe some big hugs and tears.
Yes.
Hey, and she's a big she's so cultured, and she's big on history and watching some really interesting things. We watched something about Maya Angelou last night, but also I don't know if you've heard about, Stephen, but there's a tidbit before we dig into our implementation conversations. Have you heard about what's going on in the Suez Canal?
No.
No, because you've been thinking about the baby.
No, I mean, yes and no. I don't want to say yes because I probably don't know it that way.
Well, there is a massive ship. I believe, don't quote me on the actual dimensions, but I believe it's right up there with one of the biggest ships in the entire world, and it's a container ship. And as you know, the Suez Canal is a major traffic thoroughfare for container ships and getting all of our goods from place to place so that we can have our computers, with tech stuff, and all of these different pieces. Well, this ship is so massive, and I'm not exactly sure why, but it did. There was a storm or something, and the ship is now stuck sideways. If you Google it, you can see an aerial site. It's sideways in the canal. And why do we care? Why is it important? Well, when your prices for goods start to go up, you're going to care. It's so stuck that now they can't get it unstuck. It's massive, and that port, that Suez Canal, usually has 50 up to 50 container ships a day that go through the canal to get goods from one place to another. And of course, we've already had supply chain problems in logistics with COVID, and so having this ship there is really a problem. So one of the issues is, you would think that it'd be easy to get it unstuck, but it's not. They're really struggling, and it made me start thinking about, do they have an implementation plan did they anticipate this? What's the problem solving you're coming into? It's like because they're when you look at the machines that are trying to dig the ship out from the side, they look like toys next to the size of this ship. And I just don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to watch, but it did make me think about when we start to plan for anything big, like having huge container ships go through a canal, do we have a problem solving plan for when it goes wrong? And one of the parts that when we work with people, school districts or schools on implementation, we know every implementation isn't going to go right. So we put in place an implementation team that can problem solve and look at what are we going to do, analyze the problem, what resources do we need to solve the problem, apply the solution, evaluate did it work or not. I know they're probably in the middle of that, but it made me think about looking at it. Doesn't look like they quite thought it through that way. So I thought, maybe they need some implementation specialists to come help them.
Yeah, totally. I can totally see the parallel that you're making there. I think it's a great parallel.
Well, I know I'm a nerdy implementation scientist. I take that lens. People are like, what does this canal have to do with your implementation lens? But I'm like, we should have a problem-solving solution, iterative.
Yes, totally. Well, I think we should call down there and check and see. Well, it does tie in though, I think, into our conversation today. And for decades, we both have been really concerned about implementation in schools. Year after year, and let's talk about this for a little bit as we kind of move into this topic around implementation literacy. Year after year, we really witness district and school leaders take these incredible efforts to adopt these innovations, these interventions, these practices, really designed to create lasting impact. I mean, nobody wants to adopt something and not have lasting impact, so they adopt it. They begin to implement, hoping that it will reform their teaching and their learning practices and their learning outcomes. And most of the time, and many times, a lot of these innovations actually are evidence-based. And so, because we have a lot more out there that we know what works, we have access to a lot more things that show us that that's evidence or research-based. But really, despite all that, we still see a lack of results. And we can tie that back to, and despite no matter what leadership understanding they have, despite what data-driven decision-making processes that they have, despite their institutional knowledge of change theory or the innovation itself, we still see this gap. We see the results not necessarily coming to fruition. And we both know that when you really get down to it, it comes down to that implementation. And those roadblocks that implementation, if we don't understand implementation, those roadblocks that get in the way of actually successfully implementing those evidence-based practices. So that's why I think we're really concerned about, or really want to talk about this topic around what does it mean to be implementation literate? And do we have a literacy around implementation so when we adopt an innovation, we have some baseline knowledge, understanding about what it means to actually implement something right and well, and some of the things that we know need to be present in order for that to happen.
Yeah, I think what you just described is, why are we doing this work? Stephen and I have spent many years together for a couple decades helping schools adopt things so that they can get better. And what we kept seeing is it's not a will, right? We will come to it with the best of intentions and hearts, but we end up with this gap of moving from hoping it happens to actually making it happen.
Mhm.
And people are frustrated and upset, and the casualties are learning loss. The casualties are human resources. We erode trust. We erode the 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 energy of our staff and the people that are doing it. We erode community trust. School boards, when we adopt things and we abandon them, or we just kind of do them half-heartedly and we don't get those results. And
Right.
so we have to stop them. Basically, it's like, stop the madness. We
Mhm.
know how to implement things, but we see there are some big barriers that get in the way of helping schools, once they choose a great evidence-based practice, getting it into practice in the day-to-day practice of the staff and the teachers that are there to make it work. So we get the socially significant outcomes that we selected it for. Right?
Right.
So nobody goes into it with this malintent, but somehow we don't quite get from point A to point B. Like, we really want to help make sure that gap that we all fall into, and that's like the Suez Canal, right? So there's going to be some problems, but do we have a plan in place to help get over that? And that's what, Stephen, when you mentioned the literacy, we have been talking about this for many years, but we also have a learning collaborative that we meet with
Mhm.
some other thought leaders from across the globe. You will be able to hear from a couple of them at our Global Implementation Summit. Jonathan Sharples from the Education Endowment
Mhm.
Foundation
Yeah.
in the UK,
Yeah.
and Stephanie Arsenault Height, who is the author of Leading with Collective Efficacy and a few other articles and books, just an expert, world-renowned researcher and support person for schools. We were talking with them this week in a learning collaborative around what does it mean to develop implementation competencies for practitioners.
Right. Well,
And we decided we had to back up.
yeah. Well, I mean, let's just talk about that for a second, because there is some work out there that experts in implementation science have begun to kind of unpack and develop. And what does it mean to what knowledge, skills, and attitudes do you need to have as a person who's in that role of leading change, who's actually supporting the implementation of any new innovation or any new change. So
What are my competencies?
yeah. So what
What
are
do I
those
need to be
competencies?
competent?
Yeah, and there's a plethora of competencies, and it was fascinating to have that conversation and talk about
Yeah.
all those different competencies, and then what surfaced in that conversation, and I really appreciate that surfaced was, but there's this baseline knowledge that must exist in order to build those competencies. So it's
Yes.
like I have to have some type of literacy around implementation so that I can better understand what those competencies are and then actually begin to develop those competencies. So, and then kind of the light bulb moment went on to some degree, which is, how many of our K-12 institutions actually have an institutional implementation literacy? They have a baseline understanding about the key components or key ingredients to what makes implementation work and what makes it not successful. Do they understand some of the baseline pieces that implementation science and research actually point to, that if you know these things, it will actually help you think better about how you design your implementation plan. So fascinating. Matter of fact, I want to read a couple quotes that I think are important for our listeners to hear, because we're not the only ones talking about implementation. And there are other folks that have been talking about implementation for a while, but I want you to kind of hear why the power of implementation is so critical for us to kind of embrace and really begin to start to unpack what is our implementation literacy and how do we get there. So Michael Fullan back in 2001 said this quote. He said, "No matter how promising a new idea may be, it cannot impact student learning if it is superficially implemented." Then we
Let's
have,
talk about that for a minute.
okay, let's do.
Because it's one of those, I think I did this when we were talking last time. It's like you step into the confessional moments. right?
Yeah.
Right. It's okay, right? What we know today doesn't make yesterday wrong. It makes tomorrow better. And I know I have seen large school districts, supported ones, that actually literally aimed for superficial implementation. Not with, again, not with
Mhm.
malintent, but one of the things I remember when I was a young teacher, and I said, well, we had this new, actually amazing reading curriculum that had a great scope and sequence. It had terrific rigor, evidence of working. But when I was asked about how do I do this and what is the training, I was, young primary teacher, very eager to make sure my kids were all going to be able to learn to read. The wording that I was provided, and it was written, was that what the school board purchased the materials, but we expect you to use it at least 51% of the time.
Mm.
We know you're a professional.
Yeah, right.
So with that direction, I felt like I was going to be doing something wrong, right? Even if I used it fully. But so
Mhm.
it, and I say that, and that was probably around the same time as this quote. And it was really difficult for me as a young teacher to then venture into what my gut said, this isn't quite working. These kids actually need a full, complete, comprehensive program in my instruction to make those gains.
Mm.
Right? So it was very difficult, but I ventured forth. And what I found out is when I utilized the program as designed with those active ingredients, my kids were performing. And my principal did come and he said, what are you doing differently than the other teachers are doing? I didn't want to tell him because we'd kind of been coached to superficially implement.
Interesting.
So, and I know I'm not the only one in that boat, right?
Yeah.
Because we come to the classroom with the skills that we were provided.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing there is let me read another quote and let's kind of unpack that again because it goes along the same lines. Actually, the authors of this book, Implementation, Practice, and Science, Fixon, Blase, and Van Dyke, they said what we often miss is understanding how adopting evidence-based practices is one thing. Implementation of that practice is yet another thing altogether. So again, there's an emphasis that it's not enough to simply just purchase those programs and that will do the trick. There's a
Yeah.
whole nother piece around implementation that absolutely matters in order to get the results that we're looking for. And let me just add to that Jonathan Sharples, who we talked about earlier, we were having a conversation with him. He'll be one of our keynote speakers at the summit. He and his colleagues wrote what do they call it, a guidebook, guidelines or guidebook.
School implementation guide. It's really good.
Thank you. It's a guide.
Yeah.
There's a great quote in there. It says, ultimately, it doesn't matter how great an educational idea or intervention is in principle. What matters is how it manifests itself in the day-to-day work of people in schools. And so I read these quotes because I think it's really important for people to really know and understand that we have lots of great things that work. And again, it's back to that piece of, but how are we implementing them so that they actually get the results? And are we spending the right energy on the right things so that we actually produce the results that those evidence-based programs promise? So anyway, I think that, again, educational change initiatives, they really do fall short if there's some type of implementation neglect.
Yeah, I
And
think that's actually a nice way to put it, some implementation neglect. We might get part of it really strong.
right.
And again, why does that happen? So if we think about just when we're coaching, it's like we do the best with what we know. And so that's how we circle back to our conversation in the Learning Collaborative with Jonathan and Stephanie. And we want to bridge this gap. And before we can talk about what are the implementation competencies a practitioner should have as a
Mhm.
facilitator or someone trying to manifest implementation across the system, do we even have basic implementation literacy to begin to have that competency?
Talk about the implementation neglect is we're neglecting it, and our belief is that we're probably neglecting it because we don't know much about it.
Yeah, I guess
And
it's when we
so,
know more.
right. I mean, I think it's like, once we know and once we understand, then it's hard to neglect it.
Yeah,
So,
well, and it's hard to not, it's one of those things, once you understand basic implementation science, you can't go backwards. And I think that's where we were at, where we came to this work, is
right,
we only
exactly.
work with
Exactly.
organizations and schools if we're really willing to do the work well and right, is our short way, but really understanding those underpinnings of implementation science. And when you showed the book from Karen and Dean and Melissa, oh, who Melissa actually is
It's
another
one of my
speaker.
favorites.
She's going to be one of our featured keynotes. Sorry, at our K-12 Global Implementation Summit. We're so excited to have her. She is currently the president of the Global Implementation Society.
Yeah.
But really, that works. They've been doing. This work has been going on for a long time, but we haven't quite made the gap into education field. Stephen has in the past, you did the hand washing example of health field, social welfare,
Mhm.
policy, NGOs, and that's why we are on the Global Implementation Society and work hard with them, is trying to push the information from those fields into education. But we are glad to know we're not alone, and the work is out there. But
Yeah.
we're trying to get the conversation going
Yeah.
and bridge
Well,
this gap of this implementation literacy, because we know that we can select evidence-based practices. Everyone's aware of Hattie. We know what works, but we don't get it to actually create the results.
yeah, because without really understanding, without absolutely understanding some of the key concepts and applying some of those methods and strategies and practice and the research, we really do run the risk of perpetuating this add-on culture that we have in education. That really prevails in a lot of schools. We adopt it and then we abandon it and we adopt something else, but we just keep adding on as well. And we're not really changing some of the behaviors and the beliefs. We're revisiting unrealized outcomes because those outcomes never came to fruition because we adopted something that was very expensive, but we never got there. And so we have to
And
revisit that again and solve the same problem, which fosters this innovation abandonment that we like to talk about as well. I think then that leads to some of that demoralizing perception that, that we're failing our students, we're failing ourselves because we just can't.
teachers are leaving the profession.
We just leave the
I mean,
profession.
had I not been able to have the courage to actually do what I knew would work for my kiddos and use the materials as designed with some enhancements and adjustments,
Mhm.
I probably would have been pretty demoralized at the results, because I know my other staff were, my colleagues back in the time, but I kind of had to do that in secret, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the mantra was, we didn't do anything as designed. We were supposed to bring everything. And as a young new teacher, I felt lost in that world.
Yeah.
I needed more support.
Well, and really understanding how good is good enough and what does it look like to actually implement that right and well. And so this is why we're talking about implementation literacy, because I think that we both are very passionate about, yes, the field of implementation and what its role in education. But what if we just had a baseline knowledge, a baseline understanding of implementation in our organization? So from our leaders, even to our implementers, our teachers, our support staff, if we had some key concepts and understanding about what goes into effectively implementing, then when it comes to actually sitting down and designing that implementation and then monitoring that implementation, I think organizationally we would have an understanding and accept that understanding and be excited about the possibility that now adopting this new innovation, we know we can make it work and make it work right and well, simply because we understand that it does go through some process
And stages. Implementation is a
exactly it.
process.
Yeah.
And if you go on our website, you'll see our implementation stages.
Yeah.
If you look at the NERN's work or the implementation practice and science book, they have their stages, because we know, and that isn't just by accident, because everyone who's done the scientific research knows that implementation happens in stages and over time. But there are some essential components that you can start to build literacy around. So what's exciting is that it's content agnostic.
Yeah, totally.
right? We can, it's like we know we can, if we can do it with PBIS, if we can do it with a part of our reading curriculum, or we just worked with a big district on helping with their health and COVID-19 health and safety. It was a big plan because it encompassed a lot,
Yeah.
but it's content agnostic. Once you have that literacy, you really have it and you can apply it and generalize it across different components. And I think that's why we're passionate about this
Building
area.
this
Is it,
literacy.
yeah, it's just building that literacy. And our goal over the next few years is to get the conversation going, to help bring more people in to talk about it, not make it too complex. I mean, there are some complexities and we're happy to go into those, but at least let's start talking about it and
Let
getting
me
it
just
right.
add, yeah, let me just add this one other piece just to kind of make the case of for a second. If you think about it, in education for the last probably 10 to 15 years, we've done a good job in building assessment literacy. Teachers
Mm,
now entering the field of education now know the difference between summative and formative assessment. They're now getting we have a better handle on how to design effective assessments and so on and so forth, because there was this effort to build a assessment.
assessment
It
literacy.
didn't mean you were
Yeah.
an expert in assessment. It meant that you had a baseline understanding around key research-based assessment concepts that actually improve student learning. And
Yep.
so by understanding those assessment components, like the difference between summative and formative and when to use it and how to use it and so on and so forth, you then can then go into your lesson design and go, okay, I have a level of understanding around assessment, so that helps me design my instruction better and design my assessments better.
But I
I'm
didn't have to be a
not an
Stiggins
expert,
expert,
but I may
right?
not be an expert at
Right.
it. That's
So
right.
there's, yeah. So we want to have people who have that depth and
Sure, totally.
complexity of expertise. But at least if we, I think what we've come to after talking this through with our thought leaders is that there's that baseline literacy we wish everyone would have,
Yes.
in addition to the levels of expertise that the practice the whether it's an implementation facilitator or a practice practitioner, whatever, implementation specialist on site, we would want someone to have that level of knowledge. But it'd be really great if everyone had a base level. I love it's such a great connection, Stephen. For me, that metaphor really works around the assessment literacy. It's like, oh, I get that.
Yeah. Well, and I think there is a program that we've seen in education that is probably they're saying is one of the largest, fastest growing programs, evidence-based programs in the United
It's the
States.
most scaled up in the world.
Yeah, in the world. It's the most scaled
It
up
is
in the
not just,
world.
it is the most scaled up in the world.
Yes, is the
Effectively scaled up.
right, is PBIS.
Yep.
And so I'd love to interview the kind of the original thought leaders behind that framework, because I can guarantee you that they had a level of
Implementation knowledge.
knowledge. They had an implementation literacy that helped them think about how do we design this so that we get better implementation. In that, they have implementation teams, they have a fidelity assessment, they have they have
a problem solving process.
They have a problem.
They don't expect it to go right every time.
Absolutely,
It's
yeah.
they can contextualize. One of the things that we always say is we have a few 2-3 C's, but one of them is climate, context, and culture matter.
Yeah.
And the PBIS system, along with when we're working with teams to do implementation, look, we understand the context and the climate and the culture absolutely matter.
Mm-hmm.
And PBIS has done that brilliantly by including those site-based teams.
Right. And so
right. And that's how you can address those components and make any tweaks or enhancements.
Yeah, they're not only monitoring the innovation itself, but they're monitoring they encourage you to monitor the implementation of
the innovation.
Right. So yes. Did we say what we're going to do? Did we say what we're going to do? Did we do it? And did it work? And if not, why? Mm-hmm. So when we made those changes and adaptations to whatever we're working with in there, they have a problem solving process that helps us work through that so that we can clearly better understand how our implementation is going, so we can refine our implementation and get the results that the framework outlines that we can get. So anyway, that's just another way to say, really, we advocate for implementation literacy, and we want to start unpacking that. So what does it mean to be implementation literate? And so
Yes.
we're going to engage next week into start unpacking that, probably one piece at a time. We've got a lot of ideas from, stages to activities and so on and so forth, but we have a lot of great ideas. And so let's unpack them. We'll probably have some guests to help us unpack that as well throughout the next couple of weeks, but stay tuned because we want to unpack what does it mean to gain, or what does it mean to be implementation literate?
Put simply, let's keep the conversation going around implementation literacy. I love that. Hey, Stephen, but we still want to, as we wrap up, we're going to continue to explore what does it mean to be implementation literate. But I want to remind everyone, if you're interested in this topic, we have a phenomenal opportunity for you. It is going to be May 25th, 26th, and 27th, and it is the first ever K-12 Global Implementation Summit. Go to www.impactlearnandlead.com to register, to learn more. We have amazing featured speakers, like as we talked about, the author of the Implementation Practice and Science book and president of the Global Implementation Society, Melissa Van Dyke, Jonathan Sharples from the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, Stephanie Arzani Height, brilliant co-author with Jenny Donahue on collective efficacy, professional learning, Joanne Killian, Learning Forward Senior Advisor guru for, well, we could go on and on about her with personal connections and that. And our friend Doug Fisher is back with us. He was at our summit last year, and Doug Fisher is going to be talking about it from that teacher lens. And we have lots of practitioners, actually people on the ground, who are going to talk to you about their implementation efforts so that you can actually interact in coaching sessions and World Cafe. Oh my gosh. So go to the website, check it out. Seriously, join us to get the conversation started. Steve and I will be doing a few sessions, but we want to have you join us at the summit. And if you enjoyed your content today, please share it with a friend, tag a friend, grab a friend. Let's keep the conversation going. Put it on Twitter, put it on your Facebook.
Yeah, let me just add this one thing. Think about the opportunity to join us in the beginning of this conversation in education.
Yep.
Like, be the first to start dialoguing about high quality, effective implementation in our school system. So come participate, be a part of that dialogue, learn with us, and be part of this movement that says implementation absolutely matters, and bring implementation, the lens of implementation, back to your site. I think this summit will actually help you start that journey, and I think great things will happen as a result. So join us in that effort.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
See you next week.
Bye.